Okay, Dan Ahlquist always gets one over on me, and it's no different this particular year because he did say quite correctly that he has been at all 14 of the Rochester Chesterton conferences. I've only been to 13. How many other, is there anybody else here that's been to all 14 apart from Lou and Jean? Just a couple. Is there anybody here that's been to 13? So I'm up there with the best of them. But some of you might remember that several years ago, possibly for all I know, 10 years ago, the theme of the conference was Shakespeare. So some people nodding, right? And I gave a talk on Shakespeare then. And you'll be pleased to know that although I'm sure none of you, even those of you who were here, remember anything I said then, I'm assuring you anyway that I'm not going to give that talk again. The whole topic of Chesterton and related topics is too rich for any of us to ever have to go over the same ground. That particular talk, I gave the evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism based upon the biographical and historical evidence of Shakespeare's life, and following Dale Ahlquist's lead, because following in his footsteps the most anybody can hope, maybe Jesus later when I get holier, but Dale Ahlquist in the meantime will get me most of the way, I'm sure. He advertises his books, I'm going to advertise mine. The Quest for Shakespeare is the book out there which covers the biographical, historical evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism. That was the topic of my last talk. I'm going to spend maybe 3 minutes on just some of the key ingredients there. And then I'm going to talk instead about True of His Place. So, Shakespeare's family was a Catholic family. He was born in 1564, so in the early years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, when Catholicism was illegal and indeed punishable by death. Certainly being a priest was punishable by death, and harbouring a Catholic priest was punishable by death. Failure to attend the state religion services was incurred a fine. Shakespeare's mother's family were notorious recusants. They were people that basically were defiantly Catholic and paid the fines rather than conform. And some of Shakespeare's cousins were involved in so-called plots against the regime, and a couple of them were put to death. The biggest single evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism is the fact that he bought the Blackfriars Gatehouse in London. The Blackfriars Gatehouse, as the name would suggest, was the religious house of the Dominicans in London. If you go to London, Blackfriars as a district is still there. Blackfriars Tube Station, Blackfriars Bridge, but Blackfriars, the religious house is no longer there. It was destroyed by Henry VIII, as with all the other religious houses in England. But the Blackfriars Gatehouse, the gatehouse to that community, to that religious monastery, if you want to call it that, remained in Catholic hands as a private residence. So right through, we had the property deeds, right through from the 1530s with the dissolution of the monastery, right up to 1612 when Shakespeare bought it. That house remained in Catholic hands. Not only that, it was known to be a centre for underground Catholic activity in London. There are reports of the house being raided. There are also reports of the house containing secret passages down to the River Thames, so the priests could escape. And this was the house that Shakespeare buys. And not only does he buy that house just before leaving London to retire, he mandates that the tenant of that house, the person who lived there before he bought it, should continue to live there. That person is John Robinson. He was the only one of Shakespeare's London friends to be with Shakespeare on his deathbed. And John Robinson's brother entered the English College in Rome to study for the priesthood in the very same year that Shakespeare bought that house. Lots of other evidence. I said there's a whole book out there on the topic. But there's two ways, basically, of showing Shakespeare's Catholicism. There's the historical biographical evidence, as presented in the Quest for Shakespeare, but there's also the textual evidence. In other words, the evidence to be found in the plays and the sonnets and the poems. So my second book was called Through Shakespeare's Eyes, Seeing the Catholic Presence in the Plays. And my approach to that is very methodical. I have great admiration for many Shakespeare scholars that argue for Shakespeare's Catholicism. Most recently, Father Peter Millwood, a great friend of mine, who Jesuit priest based in Japan, wrote some groundbreaking work in Shakespeare's Catholicism. He passed away, sadly, just about a month or so ago. But I don't follow his approach, because what he does is pluck individual lines from individual plays and poems and goes off on a tangent about how this is Catholic. If I were to play devil's advocate, I could pluck a different line from the same play and go off on a tangent and prove that he was a Protestant or an atheist or whatever. In other words, taking lines in isolation is not a very foolproof way. It might be suggestive, but it's not foolproof. So my approach has been to try to go through each play methodically, scene by scene. So you see the work in its integrity and its entirety in order to come to what I think is definitive proof of Shakespeare's Catholicism. So in Through Shakespeare's Eyes, I just look at three plays, Merchant of Venice, Hamlet, and King Lear, going through methodically to prove the case. But the most detailed look at one particular play by Shakespeare I've done is the book out, also set up there, called Shakespeare on Love, Seeing the Catholic Presence in Romeo and Juliet, where basically it's just one book on the one play, going through scene by scene. If I had time, I'm minded very much at the moment of niggle, because it won't happen because of distractions. Most of the distractions are very good and holy ones, such as wives and children, not wives. I'm not like Charles Dickens. I have one wife. But such as a wife and children and other things. I have distractions that will keep me from being able to do this. But in an ideal world, I would be able to write in as much detail on every one of Shakespeare's plays as I've written on Romeo and Juliet. So I just need to write another 25 books, and we're almost there. Won't happen. It might be a task or a quest for a better and a younger scholar at a later time. So I'm going to do this evening, I'm going to just go through two plays, Hamlet, but first of all Romeo and Juliet, looking at the evidence for the Catholicism. Before I do that, I'm going to give something. I think I've given this anecdote before, and I'm asking you to forgive the indulge me, okay? Because this is the one that's most close to home. Did I mention, maybe it was even last year, about being in a restaurant in Rome by myself with a bottle of good Italian red wine, having eaten a really excellent Italian meal with a copy of the poetry of St. Robert Southern in front of me? Did I mention that? Okay, good. Then either you're all asleep or... so for me, this was pretty close to paradise, this side of paradise, right? Italy, Italian food, Italian wine, and the poetry of St. Robert Southern. Perfect. So I'm just relaxed, chilling out, enjoying the solitude, reading the poetry. And I come across a poem by St. Robert Southern. Not surprisingly, the book's the collected poetry of St. Robert Southern. Astonishing. I should say at this point, by the way, that St. Robert, there's a great deal of evidence, which I do discuss in several of my books, of Shakespeare's friendship with, admiration for St. Robert Southern. Right? They were exact contemporaries. St. Robert Southern was an underground Jesuit priest in London at exactly the time that Shakespeare was in London. They have same intimate friends. The Earl of Southampton, Shakespeare's patron, has St. Robert Southern as his personal confessor. And Shakespeare and Southern are actually related as distant cousins. Moving in a relatively small Catholic world, right in the heart of the beast, England's capital city, it's even biographically unthinkable that they didn't know each other. But textually, there's a wealth of it. There's a whole, I think in Shakespeare on Love, there's a whole appendix called the Jesuit Connection, looking at these textual evidence. But anyway, so I'm reading this poem by St. Robert Southern, and it's called Decease, Release. And it's written in the first person, as if the words are being said by Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, as some of you may know, was put to death on the orders of Elizabeth I because she was the true queen, at least if you have the Catholic perspective I have. And certainly many people believe she had a more legitimate claim to the throne than Elizabeth did, for reasons I won't go into now. So she's put to death, she's beheaded. And so this poem by St. Robert Southwell, called Deceased Release, the poet, the Jesuit, puts himself into the mind of the murdered, martyred queen. So it's all written in the first person, and the imagery is of her death being a sacrifice to God, something which is pleasing to God. And the imagery that's used is of spice, precious spice that's being ground. And as the spice is ground, the aroma, the fragrance rises up like incense to heaven and is pleasing. But there's one phrase in that where Mary Queen of Scots says, "And I will be as God's spice." God's spice. And as I read this, there was a eureka moment. Oh, my word. One of my favourite speeches in all of Shakespeare is in King Lear, towards the end of the play, when King Lear says to Cordelia, "Let's away to prison." But basically they can laugh at courtiers, gilded butterflies, those who are caught up with fashion and court news and gossip. And we can be as God's spies. Now we know that Shakespeare loved wordplay. We also know that the Jesuits were known as God's spies, right? Because they had to go around in plain clothes. They had to have other occupations as a cover, gardeners or school teachers or whatever. They were God's spies. And of course that poem must have touched Shakespeare, who knew Southwell well, very, very deeply. It's written in the first person. It's prophetic, because Robert Southwell was going to be arrested, spent 3 years in prison, being brutally tortured, and then finally being hanged, drawn, and quartered. At a public execution, it's very likely, it's certainly very possible that Shakespeare was there to see and witness. So Southwell becomes God's spice. He is one of God's spies. And when Shakespeare puts into the mouth of King Lear that phrase, that's a nod in the direction of the saint in heaven. And many of Shakespeare's audience would have known that, because Sir Robert Southwell's poetry was published, and it became very popular, particularly after his martyrdom, and was a bestseller. Even the Queen is known to have read Sir Robert Southwell's poetry. All right, so that's one piece of evidence. Now I want to move on to Romeo and Juliet. I call my book Shakespeare on Love as a sort of thumbing my nose at a very bad movie that was out a few years ago called Shakespeare in Love, which was terrible. But it does show, if you like, a misapprehension about Shakespeare. And a lot of it's rooted, or can be shown, in the way that Romeo and Juliet is misunderstood, and certainly the way that Romeo and Juliet is taught. Bear in mind that Romeo and Juliet is normally taught to, should we say, adolescents, right? Junior high school age people. So exactly at the time when they're going through all those changes. And it's normally taught as the love of Romeo and Juliet is something completely beautiful, wonderful. The young lovers have it right, and all the adults have got it wrong. They just left alone to do their own thing, man. Everything would be okay, but those stupid, meddling adults get in the way. That's the way it's taught. That makes the book poisonous, because it's reinforcing destructive behaviour. But, of course, it doesn't make Shakespeare poisonous. It means that Shakespeare is being poisoned. Because let's look at this, and the evidence. When Shakespeare's writing that play, he is a parent of a girl exactly the same age as Juliet. He's writing as a parent. He deliberately makes Juliet younger than she is in the source poem. She's 13. He also implies heavily that Romeo is older than he is in the source poem. In the source poem, he doesn't really have whiskers or anything. He's still basically a boy. So their age between them is pretty close, and Juliet's a bit older. Shakespeare makes him big enough and man enough to defeat the frightened Tybalt in a sword fight. He's clearly a man. He proves himself as such, okay, in that moment, at least a man physically. So, we're talking about a 13-year-old girl. And when I was at school and I was taught Romeo and Juliet, I was told, yeah, but that was normal in those days, 13-year-olds to have sexual relations and get married. Thanks be to God for solid historical evidence. Because some historians did some evidence. What they actually did was look at marriage certificates from Elizabethan England from around the same time as Romeo and Juliet was being written. The average age of women getting married at that time was in their early 20s. The average age for men to get married at that time was in their late 20s. It was rare for women to get married under the age of 18. Almost unheard of for them to get married under the age of 60. And the extremely rare occasions when a girl of 13 is betrothed to a man, basically by an arranged marriage, there is no consummation of the marriage allowed until the spouses come of age. So in other words, it would have been more shocking to Shakespeare's world that this 13-year-old was being whipped off into this world of turbulence she doesn't understand, ultimately to her death, than it would be in our own decadent culture where we maybe take these things for granted, though we shouldn't. So you have the romantic way, their love's beautiful. You have the fatalistic way, where everything's out of everybody's control and there's nothing anybody can do, therefore no one's to blame. The romantic way, all about feeling. Oh, isn't their love beautiful? And then you have the Catholic understanding of the play, written by a Catholic parent of a 13-year-old girl. What we might call the cautionary or moral understanding of the play, or the rational understanding of the play. In other words, that love is rational. Ultimately, to love is to choose, freely choose, for an act of the reason, to lay down your life for the beloved. Following passions recklessly and selfishly is not an act of love. Following your feelings is not an act of love. So that's the correct reading, and I'll go through scene by scene. So, for instance, Romeo's state of mind at the beginning of the play. Montague, his father, says, "Black and portentous must this humour prove, unless good counsel may the cause remove." Clearly, Romeo's in some state of sort of madness. And it's not just Montague's point of view. You say, well, that's him, that's because he's a stupid adult. What does Romeo say? He talks about himself. "A madness most discreet. I have lost myself. I am not here. This is not Romeo, he's some other where. He's lost his senses." And then when I was taught the play, yeah, but that was when he was having this sort of, he's besotted with Rosaline. But when he meets Juliet, that's the real thing, right? Well, actually, what the chorus says in Romeo and Juliet, and the chorus, if you like, is pretty close to an objective voice. It's not a character with, an agenda, a particular point of view. It's the third person voice. Basically says that Romeo loved and loves alike. In other words, his love for Juliet is exactly the same as his love for Rosaline. Rooted in feeling, lustful passion, devoid of any reason or any desire for the good of the other, and you will look very, very hard anywhere in Romeo and Juliet for either of the lovers talking about the good of the other. And as for Juliet's age, even Juliet's father, Capulet, says, too soon marred are those so early made. And then we have this first meeting between Romeo and Juliet. Romeo falls in love, which has nothing to do with love, at first sight. He doesn't even know who she is, doesn't know her name, obviously has no idea about her personality. It's clearly purely physical. What else could it possibly be, right? It has nothing else to go on. And their first meeting is in beautiful English and structured, constructed in the form of a sonnet, exchanged 4 lines at a time, a sonnet. Then in their first lines, the imagery of that exchange of the first kiss is all about sin. And Juliet says, well, then you've just basically passed sin into me. He said, oh, give me my sin again. Let's do it again, right? Only one thing better than one sin, it's 2 sins. So we have at the beginning of the very first exchange what we might call a venereal dimension, right? From the adjective to Venus. It's that sort of love. Erotic. And then you get the beginning of the balcony scene and Romeo's complete contempt for chastity. His contempt for Diane, the goddess of chastity, sometimes seen as an image of the Blessed Virgin, and wishes that Juliet, the 13-year-old girl, would cast off her vestal livery. In other words, cast off her virginity for him. Juliet begins modestly. She's a girl. She blushes. But by the end of that scene, she's descended from being a modest, blushing girl to being a wanton, idolatrous girl. She's still a girl. But it's not just my judgment, by the way. I'm talking about the imagery of the language. Go back and read it carefully yourself. Where's all this happening, by the way? In a garden. With the Eve figure, innocent, young, spotless, chaste, being tempted to fall from the balcony. Then we have the words of wisdom, Friar Lawrence. It's his words throughout the early part of the play, preaching temperance, prudence, chastity, reason. Violent delights have violent ends, he says. And although ultimately through his own short-sighted, myopic will to do good, desire to do good, he messes things up. Things beyond his control actually finally cause that to happen. And at the end of the play, he confesses that. And he's willing to accept any punishment the prince places upon him as a sinner. And the prince's judgment, which I suggest is Shakespeare's, is we still have known thee for a holy man. And in spite of your mistakes, you are a holy man and you are desiring the best and giving good advice. But then look at some of the words Juliet and Romeo use about each other. If love be blind, says Juliet, it best agrees with night. And the whole imagery of that talk, by the way, is darkness, scorning the sun. Or idolatry. Romeo's words, heaven is where Juliet lives. He has no other god or goddess but her. O mischief, thou art swift. And the death of Romeo and Juliet at the end. The exchange between them at the end has the same imagery as the first kiss. The first kiss and the final kiss. What is being exchanged is sin. Because in Shakespeare, and we'll see it in Hamlet, poison is often used as a euphemism for sin. So the first kiss, what is exchanged in the first kiss is sin. What's on Romeo's lips at the last kiss? Poison. What finally kills Juliet? Well, it's sexual imagery, right? She is killed with Romeo's dagger. And then Lady Capulet says at the end, this sight of death is as a bell. It's a memento mori, it's meant to wake us up, bring us to our senses. The prince says all are punished. So here you see basically Shakespeare showing us the dangers of unbridled passion, divorced from and devoid of reason. And of course the other unbridled passion going on is the violence and the hatred of the older generation, the parents, and also of course Tybalt and others. But there's the violence of hatred, but there's also the violence of lust, both of which are deadly. Now, if Romeo and Juliet would be taught that way, it'd be having a much more edifying impact. It would be the sort of thing that you would expect a great writer who has a 13-year-old daughter to write. It's not the way it's being taught, though, in our public schools. It wasn't the way it was taught to me when I was at high school. All right, for the next 10 minutes or so, I'd like to go briefly through Hamlet. This is a play that sort of misleads many people, it's confusing many people, even great critics. So the great Dr. Johnson was confused by Hamlet and didn't think it was a great play for various reasons. T.S. Eliot called it an insoluble puzzle, wasn't that keen on it either. And you might think, well, who is Joseph Pearce to dare to disagree with Dr. Johnson and T.S. Eliot? That's probably fair enough, but I would go and argue that if you actually read the play properly, I think I've got Shakespeare on my side. And I hope to show that. Because there's two types of insoluble puzzle. There's an objectively insoluble puzzle, one to which there is no solution, that can't be solved. And there's a subjectively insoluble puzzle, one which can be solved, but we can't solve it. Right? There's nothing wrong with the puzzle, there's something wrong with us. Right? We're not up to it. So let's look at the play briefly. At certain characters. Hamlet. We get Hamlet wrong every time we try to judge Hamlet in some sort of static way. Oh, he's a procrastinator. He's depressed. He's suicidal. That's only the Hamlet we see at the beginning of the play. Hamlet is a dynamic figure who's moving forward through the play and growing in wisdom and moral fibre. So at the end of the play, he says the readiness is all, and he quotes directly from the Gospel. The ghost. Good to be talking about ghosts. We've got loads of ghosts today, haven't we? Looking forward to seeing the ghost of Dante. I've been meaning to meet him. I hope you can come to the pub later. The ghost of Hamlet's father. Well, first of all, Shakespeare makes sure that we don't think it's an hallucination, some sort of psychological problem with Hamlet, because he makes sure that several people see it at the same time. But Hamlet, far from being a procrastinator, is unlike Romeo and Juliet, is very rational, extremely rational. Okay, so he knows it's real because several people saw it, but is it honest? Is the ghost honest? Is the ghost what it says it is? Is the ghost of his father who claims to have been murdered? Or is the ghost a demon who's telling lies? So Hamlet's not being slow and procrastinating and stupid for not making an instantaneous decision. He's asking the right questions. Otherwise he could have done what Romeo and Juliet did, act passionately and killed an innocent man. That's not Hamlet's way. So he stages the mousetrap. A play within a play, which is of course a metaphor for Hamlet himself as a play within the play, all the world's a stage, as Shakespeare says, where the murder, as the ghost had revealed it, is represented on stage. And while the king, the wicked King Claudius, is watching the representation of his own murderous act, Hamlet's not watching the play, Hamlet's watching the king, to see how the king is going to respond. An entirely rational. Father Brown would be very, very happy with that sort of looking at the mystery, right? And then we have the ghost and Hamlet together demanding that Horatio and the others swear upon the sword. And they say, no, we want to swear by faith, swear in faith. In other words, swear by faith alone. And Hamlet says, no, swear on the sword. And the ghost from purgatory, because now we know he's not an honest ghost, he's not a demon, he's in purgatory because he was murdered without being confessed. All of this the ghost says himself, without having the last rites of the church or confession. He's not just an honest ghost, he's an honest Catholic ghost. Who also insists that they swear upon the sword. Now what's this? In other words, you don't just swear by faith, you've got to swear by action. And the sword symbolises, first of all, the cross. I mean, the Crusaders often had a cross on the hilt of their sword, and they would kneel in front of their sword, when of course the sword itself is cruciform. But also action, works. Don't swear by faith alone, swear by faith and works. And the honest Catholic ghost and Hamlet agree on that, and reluctantly they do it. In the midst of all this play as well, we have the spy network. King Claudius's wicked spy network, made up of lies and liars and treachery. Shakespeare had friends, including Sir Robert Southall, who were betrayed to their deaths and torture and subsequent death by Queen Elizabeth's and then King James's spy network. The Catholics in England were, well, I tend to use the word hatred, but the Catholics in England, I can't think of a better word. The spy network, it's not wrong to hate the sin, right? They hated the spy network because nobody was safe. You didn't know who was an honest Catholic and who was a spy. So a large part of Hamlet is Shakespeare venting his spleen against Queen Elizabeth's spy network. Polonius is the spy master. He spouts relativism. I know some of you have been here, heard my personal conversion story. I talk about this above all, to thine own self be true, from Polonius' speech in Hamlet, which is basically relativism. So we see the subplot of how does relativism play itself out. It plays itself out in the wicked King Claudius, it plays itself out in Polonius. Polonius gets himself killed in the act of spying. And Hamlet doesn't show too much sympathy. He says it's a fool to have been there. If you're going to spy, then that's what's going to happen to you. Laertes, Polonius' son, doing what Polonius advised him to do, is just be true to yourself. You don't have to be true to any objective reality. It's all about you. Allows his anger to get to him so much that he blasphemes and said he would kill in the church. He gives his allegiance to the devil himself against Hamlet. And of course, because of this wild, irrational passion, he becomes the dupe of the wicked King Claudius. He becomes a dupe of the devil's party. And Ophelia. One of the reasons that Dr. Johnson and T.S. Eliot, particularly Dr. Johnson, if I remember rightly, didn't like Hamlet was because of poor Ophelia. And again, Hamlet's normally taught that we should feel sorry for poor Ophelia, and we should. but perhaps not in the manner that we often think. Because we see maybe Hamlet as an abusive lover, okay? How dare he speak to her like that? Get thee to a nunnery speech, okay? Well, what's happening? Ophelia has been coerced to spy on the man she loves by her father, who's in the service of the man who Hamlet now knows or strongly suspects has killed his own father and has been having presumably an adulterous relationship with his mother. And the woman he loves is spying on him. But during that scene, to me, it's quite clear that his mood changes when he realises that's what she's doing. She's there as bait. Right? Claudius and Polonius are listening behind the curtain. A lot of anger against spies. The memento mori, I'm going to come to an end fairly soon, make sure we stay on schedule here. The memento mori, the reminder of death, is a large part of many of Shakespeare's plays, as it's a large part of much Christian literature throughout the centuries. I mean, what is Dante's Divine Comedy? The whole thing, but a memento mori. And the memento mori has always been to remind us of the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. The longest memento mori, apart from Dante's Divine Comedy, that I know in literature is probably the graveyard scene in Hamlet. Where the Great, Caesar, Alexander the Great are just pieces of dust, bunging up a hole in a wine barrel. Doesn't matter how great you are, you're going to die. And the lines that Shakespeare uses in that scene are plucked almost verbatim from St. Robert Southwell's poem Upon the Image of Death. So not just pointing to death in general, but if like invoking the death of the martyred saint. And as I said, at the end of the play, Hamlet becomes serene, settled, willing to die, no longer angry. Because as he says, the readiness is all. As King Lear says, the ripeness is all. He's ready, because he's reached that point of maturity, of wisdom, where he knows where he fits into the scheme of things. It's at this point of the play he also quotes from the Gospel. There's not a sparrow that falls, the hairs on our heads are counted. In other words, it's all in God's hands. And then what's the imagery on the sword? The sword's the image of the cross, I've said. But what's on the sword's poison? The same imagery we see in that first exchange of the kisses in Romeo and Juliet is on the swords in the final climactic events of the tragedy. Sin on the cross. That makes Hamlet a Christ figure. Because in the midst of all of this, right, Laertes is guilty. Queen Gertrude, Hamlet's mother, is guilty. King Claudius is obviously guilty. But they all die by poison. It's sin that kills them all. But it's also sin, poison, that kills Hamlet. The innocent victim. The Christ figure. And how does the play end? Ends with his good friend Horatio saying, "May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest." Which is actually a prayer taken directly from the Catholic Requiem Mass, which was illegal in England. Now, just to conclude, can we be comfortable with a play where poor Hamlet is given such a bad stack of cards from the beginning? From the very beginning, he's in a situation where his father's been murdered, his mother's having an adulterous relationship with the murderer, He's surrounded by pestilential spies, many of whom are his former school friends. Can we be comfortable with that? Well, I would merely argue that all that Shakespeare is doing is presenting to us realism. Christian realism. Because the reality is, it's not just the sinners who are the victims of the sin. Every sin takes down innocent victims. The most important of all was the innocent victim on the cross. Thank you very much.